It's a warning that we need to rapidly reduce carbon in the atmosphere and that we need to solve the climate crisis for other species and for ourselves.
I just want to ask, are you sure climate change is real?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. When you look at the kind of overwhelming body of scientific evidence, and as a scientist in my job, every day I read new journal article, new study after new study, looking at impacts from climate change around the globe to wildlife, to ourselves, to the climate. It is, unmistakably happening. There is no question that it's happening, and the question that we have to answer is, how much impact do we want? Do we want this to, how we're already kind of in the midst of an extinction crisis. We're already in global climate patterns now that are causing impacts from extreme weather events around the globe. We've witnessed that this summer with extreme flooding and drought. And the question we need to answer is, do we want this to be our future or our world? Because we can't continue on this path. We want to have a good future for ourselves and our children and wildlife. So the question we have to answer is, are we going to take action now? It's unmistakable that climate change is happening now. The question is, what are we going to do about it? And we have tools to address the climate crisis.
Okay. Before we had this show, we sat down. You were kind to stop at my studio where I make art, and I showed you a painting that I was finishing, and I was asking you for some of your opinions. So I'd like my staff, my team here, to please bring up a picture, and let's see what we have. That is you and me, and you're looking at my painting, which is called End of Species. And first of all, I was delighted at your interest, and I was delighted, although you never said it's good or bad, and I don't look for that, but I found your interpretation to be just wonderful. And you care to say anything about what you saw in that painting?
Yeah, I would. What instantly caught my eye, and we can see it now, is that kind of point toward the center right, where it looks like this mouth, and it has these ropes that are pulling things toward it. And when you look at what's being pulled toward it, it's a leaf, and it's an animal, and it's a tree that are kind of being ripped and pulled toward that mouth. And that's kind of very, a wonderful, very clear expression of what we're doing to the environment, where we're in the midst, we've done a lot of damage and pulled a lot of things into this kind of industrial mouth, and where we need to stop that pattern. We're in the midst, instead of an extinction crisis, in the midst of a climate crisis. And I think that encapsulated that very well.
Okay, good. I like that we're so on the same wavelength. And I do recall you made me think of something. I gain insights from scientists, educators like yourself. And I remember being on the phone when we talked about end of species, and you reminded, or you told me that as the continent gets hotter and hotter, or areas get hotter and hotter, various species have to rise up the mountains to cooler places. And some of them bunk into a highway and can't cross over. Others wind up at the top of the mountain, and then you said there's nowhere else for the species to go but to die. And I didn't think of that particular image, going up to the mountain and getting stuck there and then crossing over to the, but if I had, I might have included that one in there. I would like to know something about some of the successes you or your organization or other folks have had that give us hope that we can slow this threat of climate change, this threat of reducing the number of species. You got any?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the, some really good news is that we have tools, the tools that we need to solve the climate crisis right now, and it's a matter of using those tools.
What are these tools that you're referring to?
Yeah, so there we have environmental laws, so the Clean Air Act and the Endangered Species Act that were passed into law in the early 1970s with large support from a bipartisan Congress and from the public, and they have been very effective in protecting the air and protecting wildlife from extinction over the last 4 decades. And those laws have the authority and the ability to make the reductions in greenhouse gases that we need to avoid catastrophic impacts and to protect species from climate change impacts. And I think one important thing, a really important message is that scientists have found that we need to reduce carbon in the atmosphere. And that the level that we need to reduce it to is from carbon dioxide level of about 390 parts per million to 350 parts per million. That's a really important number, 350 parts per million or less, to have a safe level of carbon in the atmosphere and to avoid impacts to species and ourselves. And the Clean Air Act can help us achieve that target. So one thing that the Center for Biological Diversity has done is petition the Environmental Protection Agency, which administers the Clean Air Act, to ask them, let's use your authority, do your job to set this pollution cap, this carbon cap at 350 parts per million, and to use these successful programs of the Clean Air Act that have protected our air over the last 4 decades to clean up greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and to get us to that safe level. The other kind of key tool that we have that I use a lot in my work and that our organization uses is the Endangered Species Act, because that has been incredibly successful in preventing species extinction. And some of the tools that the Endangered Species Act provides when we protect a species under the Endangered Species Act, like the polar bear. So we petitioned to protect the polar bear under the Endangered Species Act and was protected in 2008. So the Endangered Species Act provides protections to the polar bear and to other species by it prevents the harm to individuals. It protects habitat that's really important to those species, and it protects habitat that will become important to them in the future. And it also has an important role to play in regulating greenhouse gases as well, so it doesn't jeopardize species.
So the organization you're with, which is the Center for Biological Diversity, one of the things your organization has done is petition the government to apply the Clean Air Act to set a standard for the amount of carbon in the atmosphere that you folks and other scientists feel is safe. Keep things stable, I guess. How far has that gone, and how successful has this petition, this effort been?
So the things are, the Environmental Protection Agency that is in charge of administering that law has made some initial steps toward regulating greenhouse gases from cars, from tailpipe emissions, but they haven't made the steps so far, enough steps toward setting that overall pollution cap, that 350 cap that we need. So we need a lot of voices, including your listeners, to make that a priority, to ask, to say, we want our government to make sure that we have a safe level of carbon in the atmosphere. You have the authority to do this. You have the tools right now. We don't have to wait. You have a law that allows you to do this. Let's enforce that law. Let's get to work right now to get carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases down to safe levels. We don't have any more time to lose. And in terms of the Endangered Species Act work, we've been successful in protecting the polar bear and corals. Corals are another group of species that's really imperiled by climate change, by ocean acidification and ocean warming. And we've also been able to protect 5 penguin species. And we're struggling to protect more.
Could I just... but the ice is melting in the Arctic, so how are you protecting the polar bears?
So as I mentioned, the most important thing that we can do is to reduce carbon to levels that don't imperil them. The second thing that we can do is to reduce other threats to polar bears that give them a better chance of survival while we're reducing greenhouse gas